If Noah's flood was total and universal, who terrified Moses and the 12 tribes in the desert of Canaan? The Ethiopian Bible holds an uncomfortable truth that completely changes what we believed about biblical giants. For centuries, theologians have avoided answering a question that destroys the entire accepted traditional chronology. Because if the waters covered the highest mountains, no Nephilim should have survived the catastrophe. However, 1,000 years after the Ark, 12 spies return from the north with a report that paralyzes the people. We saw there the Nephilim, sons of Anak, a race of the Nephilim. They declared trembling before the camp of Israel. That phrase, recorded in Numbers 13:33, opens one of the darkest enigmas of the entire Hebrew scripture. Because according to Genesis 6, the giants had been the main reason why God sent the universal flood. So, how is it possible that their descendants walked calmly through the walled cities of Canaan? The answer is not found in the traditional Bible, but in ancient texts that were deliberately excluded. The Book of Enoch, preserved intact only by the Ethiopian church, contains forbidden fragments about this mystery, and what it reveals about the true nature of the Anakim challenges, 2,000 years of official Christian interpretation. To understand the enigma, we must return to the exact moment when the waters of the flood finally receded. Genesis clearly states that only 8 human souls survived inside the ark built by the patriarch Noah. No Nephilim, no child of the Watchers, no hybrid was invited onto that vessel of divine salvation. But just 10 generations later, Moses sends explorers to a land populated by fearsome, colossal beings. The paradox is mathematical, theological, and absolutely devastating for any literal reading of the biblical account. Something, or someone, managed to cross the boundary of the flood and reappear in human history with renewed violence. The 12 Hebrew spies were not exaggerating when they described the terror they felt upon observing those beings. We were like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we seemed to them as well, says the original text. That entomological comparison is not poetry, but a brutally literal description of the size difference. 10 of the 12 spies returned psychologically broken, unable to imagine a successful military conquest. Only Joshua and Caleb maintained their faith, but even they recognized that the enemies were real and terrifying. The consequence was immediate: 40 years of wandering in the desert as punishment for that paralyzing fear. An entire generation died without entering the promised land because the giants had completely destroyed their will. This demonstrates that the post-flood Nephilim were not a tribal myth, but a documented historical threat. But the question continues to burn among scholars of ancient Hebrew texts and Ethiopian manuscripts. How did these forbidden beings manage to cross the flood barrier that should have completely exterminated them? Experts in apocryphal literature have proposed 3 main theories, each more disturbing than the last. The first theory holds something that few preachers dare to mention from the pulpit today. A second incursion of fallen angels would have occurred after the flood, repeating the original cosmic sin. According to this hypothesis, the Watchers would have descended again to Earth to engender new hybrids. The Book of Enoch clearly mentions that not all rebellious spirits were chained in the deep abyss. Some remained free, wandering the world, waiting for the right moment to corrupt the human seed. This theory would explain why the giants reappear with such force just a few generations after the Ark. However, it presents a greater problem. It would imply that God allowed the original sin to be repeated with impunity. That is why many ancient rabbis rejected this interpretation, seeking a more coherent explanation with justice. The second theory is genetic and is fascinating for modern researchers of ancient DNA and anthropology. It holds that one of Noah's sons, specifically Ham, would have carried the recessive gene of the original Nephilim. His wife, according to certain marginal rabbinic traditions, would descend directly from the corrupt line of Cain. The Nephilim chromosome would have remained latent for several generations, waiting to manifest genetically. And it would have violently reappeared in the descendants of Canaan, the cursed son of the patriarch Noah. This theory explains why the giants are geographically concentrated right in the land of the ancient Canaanites. It also clarifies why Noah's curse on Canaan was so severe and seemingly disproportionate for all. The patriarch would have foreseen what that lineage would yield: the Anakim, Rephaim, Zuzim, and Emim. The third theory is the oldest and is documented in Jewish commentaries from the late intertestamental period. It proposes that the post-flood giants were simply the last direct descendants of the original Rephaim. A small genetic line would have survived the cataclysm in mountainous or isolated regions of divine judgment. King Og of Bashan would be the last great visible representative of that almost extinct lineage after the universal flood. Deuteronomy describes him as the last of the Rephaim, an expression that implies a lineage in the process of disappearing. These three theories are not mutually exclusive, and many modern scholars combine them into a broader model. The truth is that the territory of Canaan was populated by multiple tribes of giants with very specific names. The biblical geography of the Nephilim is surprisingly detailed and encompasses almost the entire region of the Holy Land. Each tribe had its territory, its cyclopean fortress, and a proper name that still resonates in ancient texts. In the south, dominating the hills of Judah, lived the Anakim, also known as the sons of Anak the Great. Their main fortress was Hebron, the ancient city where Abraham had purchased the cave of Machpelah centuries before. These Anakim were famous for their impossible height and for the impregnable walls that surrounded their populations. Joshua would have to personally confront them during the conquest, in a battle that seemed lost from the outset. However, to the east of the Jordan, other gigantic peoples dominated even more extensive and mountainous regions. The Emim inhabited Moab, and their name literally means the terrors, those who provoke absolute panic. Deuteronomy describes them as a great, numerous people of high stature, directly comparable to the Anakim. Further north, in the region of Ammon, lived the Zamzummim, another tribe whose name evokes their sinister way of speaking. Some rabbis interpreted Zamzummim as the murmurers, beings who pronounced spells in lost tongues. Their height was also colossal, and they were only exterminated by divine intervention before the arrival of Israel. There were also the Horites in Mount Seir, the Avim near Gaza, and the Rephaim in the darkest valleys. The entire Promised Land was literally infested with direct or indirect descendants of the original Nephilim. But perhaps the most disturbing detail is the architectural connection between these peoples and their fortified cities. The spies described the Canaanite cities as large and walled up to the sky, an impactful image indeed. That expression is not literary hyperbole, but a technical description of the cyclopean architecture of the ancient period. The walls were built with megalithic blocks impossible to move without modern machinery or superhuman strength. There is a direct correlation between the presence of giants and this type of prehistoric monumental construction. Places like Baalbek in present-day Lebanon exhibit stones weighing over 1,000 tons perfectly assembled together. Local tradition attributes those constructions precisely to the Nephilim, the antediluvian builders of the world. If the giants were the architects, then the cities up to the sky were literally the work of their enormous hands. This also explains why Israel took so long to conquer the territory, despite direct divine military backing. The fortresses were not designed for normal-sized humans, but for defenders of gigantic proportions. However, no text outside the Hebrew Bible describes these beings in as much detail as the Book of Enoch. This apocryphal writing, considered canonical only by the Ethiopian Church, contains extraordinary revelations. Enoch recounts that the spirits of the Nephilim who died during the flood were not destroyed along with their bodies. These disembodied spirits wandered the earth without a place of rest, transforming into something new. According to the Ethiopian text, it is precisely these spirits that later tradition will identify with demons. And the spirits of the giants will oppress, corrupt, attack, and wage war upon the earth, says the manuscript. This assertion completely changes the traditional biblical cosmology regarding the origin and nature of demons. Demons would not be fallen angels directly, but the hungry ghosts of the dead antediluvian hybrids. This would explain why Jesus in the Gospels encounters these beings specifically in the region of Gerasa. That area, east of the Jordan, was precisely one of the ancient territories inhabited by the Rephaim giants. The demonic presence remained more intense in the places where the Nephilim had dominated for many centuries. The Ethiopian Bible adds another chilling detail about the corruption of the land after the flood's judgment. It states that the blood spilled from the giants permanently contaminated the soil in a nearly irreversible way. This spiritual contamination would have facilitated the return of genetic corruption in subsequent generations. There are surprising parallels between these Hebrew narratives and the myths of other neighboring Mediterranean cultures. Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki, beings descended from the sky who engendered gigantic semi-divine kings. The Sumerian royal list attributes to the first monarch's reigns of thousands of years, suggesting a non-human nature. Gilgamesh, the hero of the oldest epic, is explicitly described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. That is exactly the proportion that rabbinic tradition attributes to the original Nephilim of the ancient period. In Ugarit, a Canaanite city of the 2nd millennium BC, texts mention the Rephaim as heroic ancestors. These Ugaritic Rephaim were revered as powerful spirits capable of influencing fertility and war. The coincidence with the biblical Rephaim is too precise to be casual or a mere late literary invention. The names, functions, and physical descriptions overlap perfectly between geographically neighboring cultures. This suggests that the phenomenon of giants was not an isolated Hebrew legend, but a shared historical memory. The entire Levant region preserved the memory of an era dominated by beings of colossal proportions. But among all the biblical giants, none achieved the fame and terror of King Og of Bashan during the Exodus. Og was the last king of the Rephaim, described as a direct descendant of the original Nephilim from the previous period. His kingdom extended north of the Jordan, encompassing 60 fortified cities with towering walls and bronze gates. The description in Deuteronomy 3:11 provides a unique detail in the Bible: the exact measurements of his royal bed. The sacred text states that his iron bed measured 9 cubits long by 4 cubits wide, according to the common cubit. Translated into modern measurements, that is approximately 4 meters long by almost 2 meters wide in total. A bed of those dimensions implies that its occupant was likely between 3.5 and 4 meters tall. Some modern commentators have attempted to downplay the data, suggesting that the bed was ceremonial or greatly exaggerated. However, the Hebrew text is precise and technical, without the literary markers typical of exaggeration or hyperbole. The same book states that this bed was preserved in Rabbah of the children of Ammon as concrete historical proof. For centuries, the Israelites could physically verify that Og had existed and that his dimensions were real. The iron of the bed is also significant, as it indicated the advanced metallurgical technology of that civilization. The giants were not primitive savages, but sophisticated builders with access to specialized foundries and forges. This strengthens the link to the megalithic structures that ruled the region during the early and middle Bronze Age. Og was finally defeated by Moses in the Battle of Edrei, in a combat described as truly supernatural. Rabbinic tradition states that Moses had to jump 10 cubits into the air to strike the giant on the left ankle. That legend, though embellished, captures the perception of the vast chasm between Og and the Israelite army. The Rephaim inhabited specific valleys whose names were preserved for centuries in the sacred geography of Israel. The Valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem was for a long time a place feared and avoided by local travelers. There, according to traditions, the spirits of the ancient dead giants continued to wander among the nocturnal shadows. David would confront the Philistines in that very valley, another ethnicity that had absorbed remnants of the giant lineage. Goliath of Gath was precisely a late descendant of the Rephaim, preserved among the Philistines as a champion warrior. His height, 6 cubits and a span, is approximately 2 meters and 90 centimeters, according to tradition. The original Rephaim were much taller than Goliath, who already represented a genetically diluted version of the lineage. The lineage weakened, generation after generation, progressively losing the Nephilitic purity of their ancestors. When David faced him with the sling, he not only defeated an enemy warrior, but symbolically closed a cosmic era. The line of biological giants was coming to its definitive end, with that stone thrown in the valley of the Terebinth. However, before Goliath, other descendants of the Rephaim continued living among the neighboring peoples of Israel. 2 Samuel mentions 4 additional giants in Gath, all linked to the ancient original Nephilitic lineage. One had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 on each foot, a genetic mutation typical of ancestral hybrid inheritance. Another was named Lami, brother of Goliath, and carried a spear whose shaft was like a huge and heavy weaver's beam. These anatomical details are not literary adornments, but genetic markers consistent with pathological gigantism. Polydactyly, in particular, repeatedly appears associated with the Nephilim in multiple ancient textual traditions. It suggests that the Bible is preserving real medical observations about a genetically distinct and recognizable population. But how did all these gigantic lineages finally become extinct in the Holy Land during the monarchical period? The answer involves a combination of military, biological, and spiritual factors acting simultaneously in synergy. Joshua initiated the systematic cleansing during the conquest, eliminating entire cities where the Anakim still dominated. The Book of Joshua 11:21 explicitly declares that no Anakim remained in the land of the children of Israel. Only some survivors fled to the Philistine cities of Gath, Gaza, and Ashdod, where they would find temporary refuge. David and his captains would complete the final elimination of those last representatives of the lineage centuries later. But military warfare was only one aspect of the process of extinction of the giants in the ancient Near East. There was also a natural genetic collapse, because hybrid unions tend to produce less viable offspring. The original Nephilitic purity was diluted through continuous crossing with normal human populations over generations. Each generation was born smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable to the common diseases of the hostile Canaanite environment. It is the same pattern that modern genetics observes in any hybrid species without constant genetic renewal. Without new incursions from the Watchers, the lineage was mathematically doomed to disappear in just a few more centuries. Finally, there was a decisive spiritual factor, the presence of the Ark of the Covenant in the territory of unified Israel. The divine glory, according to rabbinic traditions, was incompatible with the continued existence of the forbidden hybrids. Where the tabernacle was established, the impure spirits progressively lost their power over the sacred local geography. The demons, spirits of the dead giants, were forced to retreat to increasingly peripheral regions. This explains why, in the time of Jesus, the demon-possessed appeared mainly in border and pagan areas. The ancient lands of the Rephaim continued to be hotspots of demonic activity even millennia after the conquest. But the Book of Enoch adds a prophetic dimension that directly connects with the end times according to tradition. The giant spirits will remain active until the great final judgment of the day of the Lord is proclaimed. Only then will they be definitively destroyed, along with the fallen angels who engendered them in the cosmic beginning. This means that the contemporary spiritual battle is a direct continuation of the original antediluvian conflict. Every exorcism performed by Christ was, technically, a direct combat against the spirits of the ancient Nephilim. Jesus himself connected these end times with the days of Noah in one of his most enigmatic prophecies in the Gospel. As in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, he declared before his confused disciples. Many interpreters believe that this comparison includes not only moral corruption, but also the forbidden genetics. If the days of Noah were characterized by the mixing between the human and the angelic, something similar could soon repeat. Apocalyptic prophecies speak of signs in the sky and extraordinary creatures that will appear before the judgment. Some contemporary theologians link these texts with the modern phenomenon of unexplained sightings reported today. They suggest we may be witnessing the beginnings of a new cosmic Nephilitic chapter, though nothing is definitive. The survival of giants after the flood takes on a prophetic relevance that cannot simply be ignored. It demonstrates that the plan of cosmic corruption was never completely defeated during the aquatic judgment of the period. It continues to operate underground, waiting for the right moment to manifest again with all its original strength. That is why understanding the post-flood Nephilim is not an academic exercise, but a fundamental theological key. It is to understand the true nature of the spiritual battle that every believer faces in their present daily life. The demons that tempted the saints in the desert were the same spirits of the ancient dead giants. The powers of darkness mentioned by Paul in Ephesians also include the Watchers eternally chained. The entire cosmology of the New Testament is illuminated when read from the perspective of the ancestral Nephilitic paradigm. Without that hermeneutical key, many passages in Revelation and the apostolic letters become dark and incomprehensible. The Ethiopian Bible, with its preservation of the Book of Enoch, offers us the complete map of this invisible cosmic war. That is why it was marginalized for centuries, by more rationalist Western traditions less open to the supernatural. Its contents were too disturbing, too concrete, too connected to the forbidden angelic world. But the early church fathers knew and cited these texts with theological normality and absolute respect. Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyon all referred to the Enochian traditions as valid and authoritative sources. It was only later, during the Western councils of the 4th century, that the Book of Enoch was excluded from the canon. The Ethiopian church, geographically isolated, preserved its original traditions free from Latin Christianity's censorship. Today we can finally access those texts and reconstruct the complete picture of the events of the ancient period. The result is disturbing, fascinating, and deeply coherent with everything the Hebrew Bible asserts about giants. The Nephilim were not a marginal detail of sacred history, but the very heart of the universal cosmic drama. Their survival after the flood demonstrates that evil possesses a resilience that few modern theologians understand. But it also reveals that the divine plan was always broader and deeper than any human mind can imagine. God allowed the survival of the giants precisely to teach Israel the true nature of the invisible enemy. The physical battles in Canaan were visual lessons of the spiritual battles that every believer would face afterward. The giants fallen by Joshua's sword prefigured the powers destroyed by the Messiah on the cross of Calvary. Each Israeli military victory foreshadowed the ultimate cosmic triumph that Christ would achieve once and for all. The account of the post-flood Nephilim doesn't end with the deaths of King Og or Goliath the Philistine. It continues in every exorcism, in every conversion, in every moment where the divine light expels spiritual darkness. The cosmic war initiated in the days of the Watchers continues to be fought today, in territories that few can perceive. Every believer is, in a sense, a new Joshua, called to conquer the promised land of the fallen human heart. Every defeated temptation is an Anakim brought down. Every sin overcome is a Rephaim eliminated forever from the field. The geographical giants disappeared, but their spirits continue to offer battle in the invisible dimensions. This is the profound, urgent, and essential message that the survival of the Nephilim after the flood conveys to us. They were not mere folkloric monsters, but the perfect symbols of the corruption that humanity carries within itself. Only by fully understanding who they were can we finally understand what it truly means to live as a child of light. The Ethiopian Bible held, after all, a truth that forever changes what we believed we knew about cosmic evil. The prophets also linked the Rephaim with the underworld, calling them spirits that dwell in the depths. Isaiah describes Sheol populated by the ancient Rephaim, receiving the pagan kings who descend after death. This connection reinforces the idea that the giants belonged to a cosmic order distinct from pure human lineage. Their final destiny was not ordinary dust, but a disembodied existence in very specific spiritual regions. That is why the battle against them required not only physical weapons, but also the direct intervention of the God of Israel. Every ancient name of the giants concealed a theological key about the cosmic corruption of the antediluvian period. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzumim formed a dark constellation of forbidden lineages upon the earth. Reconstructing that spiritual geography means recovering lost keys of the sacred history of the world. And finally, understanding why the conquest of Canaan was much more than a simple territorial war between peoples. It was, in reality, the decisive phase of a cosmic conflict initiated long before in heaven during the original fall. Every arrow launched by the Hebrews against a giant symbolically knocked down a column of the ancient angelic rebellion. That is why God ordered the complete destruction of those peoples without compromises or alliances with their corrupt kings. The genetic mixing with the descendants of the Nephilim would have perpetuated corruption over the human lineage eternally. Only a radical separation could ensure the messianic lineage's preservation until the Redeemer's final arrival. That is why the Old Testament dedicates so many chapters to pure genealogies and strict marital prohibitions. Every name preserved in those lists was a vital link in the chain that would ultimately lead to Bethlehem. The story of the giants is therefore not an exotic appendix, but the backbone of the drama of human redemption. Without Nephilim, there's no conquest. Without conquest, no Davidic kingdom. Without it, no incarnate Messiah. The entire economy of salvation is secretly intertwined with the dark fate of those ancient forbidden beings. And that is the truth that the Ethiopian church has guarded for millennia, waiting for the moment to reveal it again. Perhaps the Nephilim were not just a closed chapter, but an echo that still resonates in the heart of the visible cosmos. Their shadow extends over the sacred texts like a perpetual warning directed at every subsequent human generation. Understanding their history reveals the terrible cost of cosmic rebellion against the established divine order. And recognizing that every present spiritual battle sinks its roots in that ancient conflict between heaven and earth. If you have been fascinated by this ancient mystery, subscribe to continue discovering truths forgotten for entire centuries.